So once again, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We have a good small group here, which is what we intended so that we can have a discussion and go down rabbit holes if needed. And so it's the first annual, maybe, masterclass on climate change and reporting. We're going to we have time, and because it's a small group, we will go around and do introductions in a second so that Chris can know who you are. And so I will start by introducing Chris. And then Chris, when you're done, just hand the baton to whoever you'd like to on your screen. And when you introduce yourself, let us know what station you are at in what particular city, if applicable, and also if you have a beat or simply just interested in this subject. So I'll hand it to you, Chris, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks so much, Holly. And I do see a few familiar faces when I was on the panel with Kate a couple weeks back. So it's great to return. It's great to have this group and to chat with all of you a little bit about climate change. I have been a meteorologist for 20 years, and most of those 20 years were in broadcast. Ranging from Rochester, my first job, where the biggest market was Boston, and then I was a chief meteorologist in Des Moines. And during Hurricane Harvey, I made a big push to cover climate change regularly, and we started the first weekly series on affiliate TV on climate change, which was really kind of exciting. And that lasted for a couple of years until I became chief meteorologist in Des Moines. Unfortunately, during my time in Des Moines, there was some pushback. They hired me to cover climate change. They kind of pulled back on wanting me to cover climate change. And after 2 years, I left, and I'm now a senior climate scientist at an environmental and coastal engineering company. But I also, in this current role, help in communicating, because I work with a lot of engineers who are great people, but maybe not the best communicators and really don't know the best ways to communicate some of their work to clients, which are oftentimes municipalities, and in turn, citizens who attend public meetings and have to kind of internalize all of the work that we're doing. So just a little bit about me. I want to get to know some of you. Stephen, if you want to start, since you're to my upper left, and then pass the baton to somebody else.
I'm Stephen Caranda. I did not sign up for this, so you're welcome that I'm here. I am the managing editor of the Kansas News Service. We have people in all kinds of beats across Kansas, and I'm hoping at least one more of them will show up here in a moment. So why don't I introduce the other editor of the Kansas News Service, Emily Yonker.
Well, he introduced me, so I don't have much more to say. I'm the news editor here. Yeah.
And where are you sitting right now? Like, what city are you in?
I was going to say, we should say the stations that make up the KNS, Emily.
Yes, yeah.
So the Kansas News Service is a collaboration of KCUR, KMEW in Wichita, High Plains Public Radio, and
Kansas Public Radio in Lawrence. Those are the main ones.
Yes, and right now I am sitting in our newsroom at KCUR in Kansas City.
You got to pass the baton to someone.
The next person I see is Skylar, so I'm going to toss it over to Skylar.
Hi, my name is Skylar Rossi. I'm an editor at Harvest Public Media. I'm in Columbia, Missouri right now. That's where I live and work out of. But yeah, Harvest Public Media covers regional stories across the Midwest and the Great Plains, focused on agriculture, food, rural communities, and certainly climate change is in a lot of our coverage and kind of looking at the intersection of all of those things. But yeah, excited to be here. I'm also a late edition. Maria, I'll pass it to you.
Hi, Chris. I'm the managing editor of Harvest Public Media. You spoke with Elizabeth Rembert, one of my reporters, a while back on a story she did about all the pushback that weather experts face around climate change. I'm based in St. Louis, and yeah, I'm going to pass it to Hector, who's another one of our team members.
Hi, everybody. My name's Hector. I'm an environmental and agriculture reporter for Harvest Public Media and KCUR, the NPR station in Kansas City. I live in Columbia, but I travel to Kansas City a lot for stories and for because we're based out of KCUR. Yeah, I think that's about it for me. I will pass this over to Haley. Haley?
That's me. It's Hallie, but it's okay. I'm Hallie. I am a producer with Up to Date, which is the morning talk show at KCUR. We're all the producers on the show are kind of general assignment, but I have a particular interest in climate and environment coverage, and especially just like trying to figure out ways to make it work best for like conversations based or audio first, like talk content. So yeah. Oh, I will pass it to Isabella.
Hello, Holly. How you doing,
Hello. Hope your
Haley?
new job is good.
Thank
I just
you.
saw Isabella in Des Moines literally like yesterday when I was there.
Yeah, literally, yeah, just this week. Well, hello, my name is Isabella. I'm based out of Des Moines. I'm currently in North Central Iowa at my home, but yeah, my role is a Central Iowa reporter. So my beat isn't necessarily like environmental or agricultural, but sometimes we have to like some of the stories that I'm working on sort of dabble in that. So yeah, I'm just excited to be here.
Pass the baton to someone.
Oh shoot, sorry. Um, okay, I'll pass the baton to Jaina. Is that how I say your name?
You're muted, Jana or Jana.
Well, you're not
Yeah.
muted. We can't hear you.
No.
Yes, okay.
I'm Jana
I
Roche.
think I just heard you. I heard you. Oh no, I saw one of your stories online today. So kudos about the
thank you.
4-H, the 4-H
Thank you.
thing.
Yeah, that was a fun one. The kids are all right. They are prepared. I'm Jana Roche. I'm based in Columbia, Missouri. I work for KBIA, and my beats are energy and utilities, rural communities, agriculture with a specific focus on sustainable agriculture. And I love covering where those beats intersect as well. So
Pass the baton.
sorry, everybody's forgetting. How about Luke? Did you go?
I didn't go. Excuse me, I'm Luke Martin. Oh, my camera is sorry. An editor at KCUR in Kansas City, Missouri. I edit Julie Denechet, our arts reporter, and I am the local editor for Frank Morris, our national correspondent. And much like Coranda, I didn't sign up for this. I'm just kind of hanging out to see if I can glean anything useful from it. I'm sure I will. And I apologize in advance because, like most editors, I'm very busy and I'm probably kind of multitasking. Sorry, I'm editing a digital piece in another window. So I apologize in advance for that. I'll pass to, let's see, whose name do I know how to pronounce correctly? How
Kaylin or
about,
Celia?
okay, how about Celia?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, my camera doesn't work, so even if I wanted to turn it on, it would not work. Apologies for that. I am in KMUW, which is in Wichita, Kansas. I'm a general assignment reporter, but I kind of like to cover housing issues as well as environmental issues. I've mostly looked at kind of like pollution, contamination issues, but I'm interested in climate change and getting into how that's going to impact Wichita in future years, and currently. So thank you.
Pass the baton, Celia. You've got
Kaylin.
and Michelle. Okay, Michelle will get to you.
Hi, I'm Kaylin. I am the Western Kansas reporter for the Kansas News Service and High Plains Public Radio. So I cover the western half of the state, largely kind of some of how climate change will affect the less populated part of the state, agriculture, rural life, just kind of how all those sorts of things affect Western Kansans and the rest of the state at large. So that's me. And who else is left that I pass it to?
Michelle is left.
Michelle.
Oh, you are muted, Michelle.
You're muted.
Oh, there we go. I'm with KSMU in Springfield, Missouri, and I'm the news director here, but I wear a lot of hats, editor. I do my own reporting as well and writing of stories because we're a very small staff. But I am really interested in climate change and trying to identify some ways that we can cover it here locally and how it's impacting our part of the state.
Great, a really nice group here. I forgot to say that I'm in St. Louis. I don't think I've met Jan in person yet, and maybe not even Kaylin. I do consider this in person, just for the sake of the fact that we're all remote. So, without further ado, Chris, are you ready for me to share your screen, or do you have a preamble?
Oh, yep, I can do a screen share. I
yeah,
can.
go ahead.
Yeah, and while I'm sharing, I can do a preamble because Hallie and Jana and Isabella all asked awesome questions, which we're going to talk about during the presentation. So we'll get to those and hopefully a lot more from the rest of you. And if they come up organically, by all means, I'm used to producers jumping in my ear and interrupting my weathercast. So feel free to interrupt this. And if you have questions or need clarification or anything, please make this a conversation, not just talking to you, because all of you have such an important job. And I would argue the coverage in this part of the country is so critical because your listeners are the people that really need to hear it most. And I think through this presentation and through our conversation, I think it can kind of help with some of the tools to make it a little bit easier and go through some of the do's and don'ts. One of the questions was about climate deniers and dealing with them. And it was funny, I showed this graphic at a talk that I was giving to continuity professionals. And I said, the natural variability that you see in this graph are the ups and downs. So that's your El Nino years, your La Nina years, other things that are affecting the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And he looked at this and he said, gosh, something happened in around 1900. And I said, yeah, the Industrial Revolution. And I think he was so just tied up in his ideology that he just couldn't see past that. So that is such a great graphic to show that, yes, there have been changes in CO2, but this is a change that we really have never seen before in Earth's history. We've had interglacials, we've had glacial periods, and we know this through ice core and ocean sediment, just how much CO2 was in the atmosphere hundreds of thousands of years ago. So we do have a fairly accurate data supply. So when you're doing maybe a web component to your story, if you're responsible for that, there are great visuals that you can get through NASA climate as well. And I'll kind of fast forward this timeline and you can see the trend, right? All of the red bands are the hotter years in closer and present time. And they're seeing the largest distribution away from that normal. And when you're looking at climate normals, sometimes people get caught up in a 1 or 2 degree change seems like no big deal. But you have to understand on a global scale, that's a big deal. This isn't going from 61 day to 90 degrees the next. Yes, climate has impacts on day-to-day weather, but these changes are global and they're over long-term periods of time. So that's why it's alarming when you're seeing a 1 to 2 degree variation in those long-term averages. So that was an image from NASA, which again, free to use, free to incorporate. I always talk about how we know that we have this much data, and sometimes just putting this information into important because it takes people that are skeptical and are going to fire back. Well, how do you know what happened a million years ago or 500,000 years ago? And this is a good answer to that. Because we have ice core data from all over the world, from the highest peaks to Antarctica and everywhere in between. And that really gives us a great understanding of what the atmospheric makeup was during those time periods. So incorporating things like that, talking about how that there's a correlation between CO2. So plotting CO2 emissions and global temperature averages on the same plane, on the same graph, is also really valuable to show, yes, we are affecting it, because as CO2 goes up, so does temperature. And sometimes you might get pushback and say, well, the temperature isn't a straight line. Well, that's where we have natural variability. That's those El Nino and La Nina years that we have. I know some of you in your questions have cited Climate Central. I know they're really good for a visual medium, but again, for your web stories, for polling data, it really is a good resource, even for the radio side of things. The other thing I always got as a journalist, and yep.
Sorry, I just had a really quick question, sort of
Yeah.
on the historical time frame of this.
Mm-hmm.
If this change really started occurring around the time of the Industrial Revolution, when was it that scientists really took notice of it and started talking about it as an issue?
As early as there was an article in the 1920s that said carbon dioxide, this is a New York Times article, is affecting global temperature. And then one of the leading scientists at Exxon, you may have heard this before, and some people maybe think it's just a rumor or just a false claim, but it is accurate. Their scientists showed that there were going to be negative effects of burning fossil fuels, and that data was never made public. But then it was, and that was back in the 1960s and 70s. So we have a significant amount of data and scientists from decades ago that knew this trend. But a lot of this, and I think, Emily, when you look and when you talk about things, because it was so far in the future, it didn't really get the momentum that it has now. Like, right, even when I started as a journalist, we'll see a foot of sea level rise in the next couple of decades. Not right now, right? But now it's here. And we're no longer talking about what's going to happen in the future. I mean, we are, but we have enough content and enough that should really kind of get people interested and engaged in part of the conversation just by the changes we've seen so far. And we can already connect those dots between extreme weather and climate change. So yes, even from the 20s to the 60s, we had evidence, but it wasn't really until around 2000 that we're really starting to make these connections.
Great, thank you.
Of course, and you'll have a lot of skeptics that kind of push back or maybe are asking these questions about, well, it's the climate scientists that are getting the grant money that get funded through the government. So it's this vicious cycle of, well, if they don't say it's climate change, then their funding is pulled. That is incredibly inaccurate. And climate scientists, and I think this is an important story to also tell, have looked at every other possibility, because blaming it on humans is, quite frankly, the most difficult thing for us to control, because it takes an entire society and turns it upside down, because we have to recreate, we have to reinvent, and it's going to be costly. So we've looked at natural cycles, we looked at volcanic activity, which even in the short term lowers the atmospheric temperature because it adds actually a little bit of a layer of protection, reducing incoming solar radiation. Solar variability, that lasts about 11 years every solar cycle. So you can see on some of those larger trends, those trends last a lot longer than just 11 years. Milankovitch cycle, having to do with the Earth's orbit and tilt. Again, we've looked, we've tried to find the data, we've tried to look at the data we've had so far, and it doesn't line up. So really, this was a very difficult idea to come to terms with as scientists, because it would require the most effort to really get under control. And then I try to follow it up with natural cycles, even through the 30s and 40s. This is why we didn't get a lot of coverage. Even though we knew by the 1920s, we still had temperature anomalies, or that average global temperature that was below average, until we hit that tipping point into the 50s and 60s, and certainly after the 1970-75 timeline. And we've now had 546, I believe, consecutive months where the temperature's been above average. If that wasn't a trend, we'd see 1 or 2 months in that stretch that were below average, and that's just simply not happening. So another way to kind of counter that point that, it's a cycle. a cycle isn't a trend, right? You're seeing this kind of building up over time, and that buildup hasn't stopped. I forget who asked the question, maybe Jana, maybe Hallie, about what should you be tying into your stories. And I talked a little bit about this at the panel, and there aren't connections to be made everywhere. For example, like a random tornado that touches down in rural Iowa isn't necessarily contributed to climate change. You can't make that attribution. And science is improving. In fact, I just found a great peer-reviewed article that found that hail is in fact tied to climate change. And this was just, you might want this story, and I'll be happy to send that article, because this has implications in the insurance industry, in farming, less instances of those small hail events of like pea-sized hail. But because of climate change, there's more energy and there's more volatility in the atmosphere, and that leads to larger hail cases. So we are seeing a greater number of events where there's 2-inch or larger hail, that's when you start seeing holes punctured into roofs, cars being dented, crops being just decimated. But when it comes to the attribution science, the connections we're absolutely able to make: stronger, more intense heat waves, longer heat waves, dry spells, flooding, right? You have this weather whiplash, which Dr. Jennifer Francis is a great resource to talk about that. One of the leading climate scientists to say, at the end of the year, you might show that you had average precipitation, but if that all fell within 2 or 3 days in flooding rains, that doesn't necessarily help a drought. So that's that kind of weather whiplash. You see the hot and dry events, but you can also connect heavy rain events as well. And then tropical cyclones. And this year, I know people are probably scratching their heads a little bit. What was supposed to be an explosive year was a bit of a bust. There are meteorological reasons for that, but the climate science of it showed that there was a lot of gas for this hurricane season to work with that we just didn't tap into. Left at the pump. The triggers for these storms to get going just didn't happen. And that is weather related. But the ocean heat content still at record levels across the Atlantic. So when you're talking about stories about flooding, you can say things like, for every degree we warm, the atmosphere holds 4% more moisture. And that's what this looks like. When you have a flood event, you can say, this is what that looks like. This is what that 4% more moisture looks like. And that really is an effective tool. And in some cases, even in parts of the Midwest, if it's snowing at 25 degrees a few decades ago, the temperature's warmed up. It's still snowing at 30 degrees, right? It's below 32, but the temperature's gone up by about 5 degrees during those two storm events, right? A similar storm a few decades ago, a warmer atmosphere, that same kind of storm system hits, it holds more snow because the atmosphere holds more moisture, and when it's below 32 degrees, it can be in the form of snow. So that isn't a contradiction that there are some official climatological weather sites that are showing upticks in snowfall just because we haven't reached that threshold of where most winter days are above 32 degrees. So again, just one way to tie it in. We talked about this the last time. This is how it affects your listeners. We're seeing less time between billion-dollar disasters. So if you're covering this, a disaster that happens, whether it be drought, whether it be a big severe weather outbreak, whether it be floods, you can tie in little bits of information saying, the rate of return that we see a billion-dollar disaster is down to every 2.5 weeks in the United States. And who's paying for it? Every person listening is paying for this damage. So those are just creative ways that this story might not be about climate change, but you can kind of thread in how it's made worse by, or maybe it is caused by climate change entirely. But you can make those connections and use these tools to kind of insert it into your stories, because it is really important. What I learned, which is pretty fascinating, after all of this happened, I got involved in a project with Adam McKay and his team, and they've founded Yellow Dot. Adam McKay, if you're not familiar, he did all of the Talladega Nights and a lot of the Will Ferrell movies that became successful. They said that showrunners are now encouraging producers to incorporate climate talk into their movies, into their sitcoms, which is pretty fascinating. And I think we as an industry in news can do something similar, because it really isn't out of place to do, right? You don't need both sides. That's a false balance, because there's enough scientific data to prove that climate change is caused by humans. So again, I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but I wanted to say that natural, but when you do it more and more, I think your listeners will start to just take it as fact and science. If you hear it every once in a while, then there's just going to be that continued pushback. So if you look at just flood losses in the mid-Atlantic, I mean, this is why, this is just some recent data. This is why, you can tie in what this means for your listeners. And I mean, you can pull this data for all over. I just pulled this again for the mid-Atlantic. But other stories that you can tie into that are natural, right? The systems that help us deal with heavy rainfall, stormwater infrastructure. All of that was built on the idea that the climate was stable. And for many decades, even in some older parts of the country, centuries, that was largely true. We weren't seeing these large extremes. So you're building these systems for a 0.1% chance of occurrence, but we're seeing those events now happen much more regularly. So stormwater systems can't handle it. And nobody wants to talk about what's happening below ground. And certainly no one wants to be paying tons of tax money and supporting projects that's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But these are the ways that we really need to capture the audience and tell them that climate change is already here. And even if you don't believe in the science, you're still going to be paying for it through infrastructure projects, through insurance. Whether you maybe haven't had a claim, your insurance rates are going to be going up because they get those same peer-reviewed papers that show that hail instances are going up. I met somebody in West Des Moines that replaced their roof twice in 2 years because of hail. If you think about the cost of a roof, that's $15,000 to $20,000 for a decent-sized home in West Des Moines. You're not paying that much in homeowners insurance. So again, there's a natural thread right there to talk about, well, what happens? Well, you're starting to see insurance companies pulling out, increasing monthly costs and annual costs. So again, this is just a slide to give some ideas. Across most of the Midwest, we are seeing increased intensity when it comes to rainfall. So this isn't necessarily the total, but how much rain comes down in that instant, in that exact moment that it's raining, that's gone up. So an intense downpour 20 years ago looks different than it does right now. It is heavier. And at the end of the day, it causes more flooding. So again, this isn't as relevant for all of you. I mean, it is, because at the end of the day, when there's $1 billion disaster on the Gulf Coast, we're still picking up the pieces. And people assume that it is just melting ice, but taking it back to the classroom, thermal expansion is when you see water expanding as it warms up. So it literally grows, and growing vertically means sea level rise as well. So I think, especially in this part of the country, one of the biggest misconceptions is there's no consensus. And I still hear from people that say, well, not everyone believes it. Only a quarter of the people listening believe that all scientists, the 99.97% of scientists that know anthropogenic climate change is happening, like that's a consensus. People don't believe that. 75% of people don't believe that. So that's another fact that you can kind of bring in. Nearly 100% of the atmospheric and climate science community shows that climate change is caused by burning of fossil fuels. So I guess just going into some do's and don'ts, and I want to leave as much time as I can to more Q&A, but talking like a human is really important. I think it was Cecilia's example. Again, I don't think you necessarily mentioned climate change, but it was a really great article or a story that I listened to that, had a lot of data, but it told a story. about watering restrictions and being proactive about that. And, I just loved how you brought the listener on a journey, and that's what we need to do. You can't just be filled with science. And as a scientist, I think that was a little bit harder for me, especially early in my career. But I would kind of weave into my story, my weather story in this case, when I was in Des Moines, just some little facts of information that weren't just, slamming it into people's brains. It was done tactfully, right? So just keep it simple, keep it relatable. And what research has found, and I'm happy to send this to you, it's Talk Like a Human. Terms like decarbonization and net zero in one ear and out the other. That's what the research has found. So when you use terms and you have a great ability to do this on the radio side, pollution, like everyone can get on board and be against pollution. Doesn't matter what your political beliefs are. CO2 is a form of pollution. Overheating, using descriptive words to get people to know, oh my gosh, this is how I feel. What you're saying, I'm realizing what I'm feeling, and you have that ability in your jobs to do that, which is awesome. Polarizing it, now that I'm out of TV, I'm a little bit more cynical. I would not use my examples anymore because I use the term climate crisis. Maybe I shouldn't, but really research has shown that isn't the most effective way to communicate it because it's polarizing. It turns people off. People get paralyzed. People get paralyzed when they don't feel like that they can take any actions anymore, when it feels like that they're kind of stuck. They can't do anything to help the situation. That's not a good thing. And we want people to kind of have actionable items to take from maybe listening to a story. Turning what they're hearing into action is the best possible scenario. Again, being rational and factual. I had a lot of good climate activist friends in Iowa who would say, well, why aren't you saying that these tornadoes were caused by climate change? And I said, well, they weren't. You could maybe make a loose case that it was a lot more humid because of climate change. But the times that we're attributing things to climate change that aren't really tied, or the evidence is weak, that hurts the work of climate scientists that are actively trying to find these connections and finding ways to connect the dots. Look, what we're seeing now is motivation enough. When you turn on the news and you hear and see some kind of disaster, whether it be off the top of your head, what you think, extreme weather, but also housing issues where people are spending more to cool off their homes, that is a direct tie to climate change, where that energy gap is in some communities where household incomes, 25% of it goes to heating and cooling. That's a climate story, and that should kind of scare people and motivate them. That is a truth that's happening right now. You don't need to find these obscure ways to maybe tie in climate change. And I'd encourage you to make sure that you have that expert on speed dial. I'm happy to email, to call at any time and just say, hey, is this connected, or should I maybe not say that there's a correlation between what we're seeing and climate change? But again, what we're seeing now is extreme enough. Political biases, don't make it political. And in one of the slides, you'll see that, I say, don't interview politicians for your stories. Try to limit that as much as possible. Chances are it's going to be a Democrat that is talking about climate action. And if that's the only person that you're hearing, then obviously people are going to say, well, this is a political issue, when it's not. It really isn't. Carrie Emanuel is one of the leading experts on climate change and meteorology and connecting the dots. He is a conservative, lifelong conservative. And he was one of the initial ones to find these connections. I'm noticing that there are some chats. Let me see. Okay, see some comments. So a couple of months of hurricane season. Nothing, you're absolutely right. I mean, things could go. That is absolutely true. All right. So who are those people that you can talk to in your stories? It's the botanist in Cecilia's story, I think she was a botanist, who was talking about ferns. That's who. You don't need, I did interview, the one politician I interviewed, actually two, was the current governor, Maura Healey, who went after the big oil companies and was one of the first states, in this case the Commonwealth, to sue big oil. I mean, that was a story and it kind of needed to be covered. The other was
That's Massachusetts.
Yeah, sorry, in Massachusetts, Massachusetts governor. So she was one of the first ones. I talked to Senator Markey, who was also in Massachusetts. That was the father of the Green New Deal. Again, tough to cover the Green New Deal without him talking about it, right? But I would any other time limit that exposure because I didn't want people to polarize it. I wanted to talk to the firefighters who are out blazing, fighting a fire in blazing heat. They don't need to necessarily talk about climate change, but they can talk about having, the canteens out there, which are, so I was a former firefighter. So canteens are those cooling stations that they can go in, grab some water, remove their turnout gear. That's a great story. And then you can show we're seeing this many more days above 90 degrees, this many more days above 100 degrees. And I'll show you a great tool to do that for your exact area. And you can do it yourself without having to call a scientist. But those are climate stories that you can tell through the story of another person, a trusted person, a teacher, a firefighter, a business owner. You have to think outside the box, but there are a lot of people that can kind of help you tell that story. Farmers is a great one, even though I would talk to farmers who would say, yes, we're seeing major changes, but because it didn't necessarily fit with their ideology, they'd not use the term climate change, or they would, and they wouldn't believe that humans are causing it. And I do tell people that you don't necessarily need the audience to believe that climate change is real or the science is real, but they need to understand that not taking action will eventually cost more than any climate action that we do take. There's about a 1-to-7 ratio. So every dollar that you spend on mitigation and adaptation, so that's mitigation, cutting CO2, adaptations, putting in irrigation systems to deal with drought, right, in parts of Nebraska or Iowa. So doing that costs less, and you'll get $7 in return in recovery costs if that flood hits, if that drought happens. So that's a great figure that I think really helps sell the investment for the Inflation Reduction Act, the Green New Deal, the Green New Deal. While it sounds expensive up front, its potential in savings is unbelievable and hard to beat.
I will mention a local source that is great. My neighborhood has a Facebook group, of course, and they're always complaining about things. But one of the things that I've seen that is a climate change thing is that we do have a lot of flooding. So storm drains. This is a community that was built in the 1900s. It's whole streets flood, not just a little bit, unpassable. There's people in certain parts that are lower that continually have flooding and flooding and flooding in their basements. And you can hear these stories in your neighborhood groups. And then the hail issue with the roof is another one, hail, or my car or whatever. So it may seem a little bit not intuitive, but you can find real people a lot of times in those places. And they're so fired up that if a journalist says, can you tell me about that? Or if they're having trouble with their insurance company, that's another, that I really would love to do. And maybe Midwest Newsroom will do something in 2025. The insurance rates are going up. We've seen in Florida where some companies are just not doing Florida. Could that happen here? I mean, so I think that would be a really interesting regional story. But Facebook groups, any other kind of group like that. Nextdoor, I hate to recommend because it's a hot mess, but your Facebook group in your neighborhood or different neighborhoods in your community may be great sources for finding people affected by climate change.
Absolutely. And the other side, to add to that, there are groups, and I forget who was I know he's multitasking, the editor for one of the art segment. But
That's me. Yeah,
okay,
that's me.
So when I was in Iowa, there was this art gallery that is on Valley Junction, which is the old part of West Des Moines, and they did all artists doing some kind of climate contribution, right? So we had one, we didn't, I mean, Des Moines Station, that was a big enough market to probably have an arts person, but we didn't have anyone devoted to it. But that would be a natural story for an arts person to talk about, to say, hey, all of these local artists are finding a way to creatively talk about climate change through their profession, through what they do. And some of it was super abstract, and you needed to kind of hear their story and their process. And another great one that I saw was an actual arts person, I think it was for BBC or Sky News, who these students did this art installation of using neon bulbs, showing how sea level would look by 2050, which was really cool, like an artistic way to show climate change. People walking by, what are those lights? What are those vertical lights doing? And then they learned a little bit about climate change. So literally every beat can cover it. And I thought that those were kind of two ways that even the arts, there's that connection.
I'll note just real quick, I
Yeah.
love those examples, and I also think it's a great way to like depoliticize the whole climate change debate as well, and sort of like take the contention out of it. I will just say I've been noticing a lot of like parks departments and similar types of groups bringing artists in to do projects. Julie, our arts reporter, is working right now on like a photography project where some guy found like 170-year-old photos, went to the place where they were taken, took a modern photo, and saw like the landscape change with all of these new trees in the middle of the Kansas prairie that were never there 150 years ago. So that was also like a really cool kind of way to get at it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think on the last call too, let's bring in the sports people. And I don't think there's anyone on this call, but you all had one of the hottest starts to school ever. And there was an athlete, a male football player that died. That is a climate story. I tried so hard. I loved my sports director, so good. He saw my pushback. I get that he didn't want to get pushback, but I said, look, delaying the start to football season, which is an, iconic Midwest Friday night football, that's a story. Like, it's having impacts on people, and people like, that's a great way also to depoliticize the issue, because we're seeing it, we're living it, we're feeling it. So yeah, excellent. And thanks, Luke, for that example. I mean, people need to think outside the box for these stories, that maybe it isn't directly climate change, but it can be environmental, which again, it's all connected. So it's important to, again, for the longest time, just the evolution of covering this went from polar bears in the Arctic. You couldn't be farther from really anywhere civilized, right? Where there were, I mean, yes, there are some tribal communities that are in the Arctic Circle that could see the changes, but really, we weren't seeing it. And climate change stories where the polar bears have less territory, they're maybe entering into these tribal communities, but it seems such like it's so far down the road, we don't need to be talking about it. And then we started focusing about climate projections, which is important, but it does lose people, because if your average listener might not be around by 2070, certainly not 2100. So make the connections now, find ways to show that, we're already seeing this change, but, just think about what it's going to be like down the road. But you need to tie in what's happening right now, or you're going to lose people, because people don't care. When people are worried about, they're just keeping up and keeping their head above water until their next paycheck clears. I know that these issues seem so distant. So try to do ways to localize it. Try to find ways to localize it. Try to find ways to talk about any solutions in a way that can be, now versus, the problems that it's helping now, not just by 2050, right? So planting trees, for example, would be a great way to cut down. It would be a good way to absorb CO2, but it's a good way to cut down that ambient temperature, that air temperature. in cities, and especially in environmental justice communities. Lack of green space is a big deal. Well, those are solutions that are happening right now, and the results, the impacts of planting those trees are essentially immediate. As soon as there's foliage, as soon as there's leaves on those trees, they begin that cooling process, and they're already capturing that carbon. So again, it's important to still talk about some of these longer term impacts that what we're seeing now will only get worse, but just don't hyper focus on long distance, because they go back to that first principle or second principle, which we're already seeing it now, and our reality now is bad enough for people to act. So again, find those people, those trustworthy messengers. And I mentioned this a couple slides back, but doctors are another good one, right? And something that actually Kate, I think is she from Kansas? No, St. Louis, made me aware, and I was unaware, that George Mason University and the Yale program on climate change communication found that for people that are more conservative, the one scientist that they really listen to are doctors. They're PCPs, they're primary cares, they're general medicine, general practitioners. So talk to them about how during the pandemic, for example, and we had those Western wildfires, how that was making their job hell. They're dealing with people that with asthma, with emphysema, with COPD, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with bad air quality. Have those people tell those stories too. So all of those people that you see on the list, the top two lines, are more trustworthy in people's minds than politicians. You don't need them to tell your story. So I guess just my last little bit before we go into some questions, using and your ability to use vivid language. I think in TV, we have the ability to use video, which makes our job easier than what you have to do. But a lot of times our editors and producers would take any of our creative writing and our added language to kind of build that story and say, you need to do this in 60 seconds. You can't have 90 seconds. And I think a lot of times you guys do have that ability to use a little bit more descriptive language. And I think that really does resonate with the listener. It makes it real, and it helps them see the impacts that are happening right now. And just be careful if you do use scientists, if you use a quote from them, they can be super technical. Don't be afraid to just say, well, I know what that means, but I want to make sure everyone knows what that means. So how does this crazy stat, what does that mean, right? So all of that technical jargon about like why hail is larger in that peer-reviewed paper that I was talking about earlier, what does that mean for people? It means that what Holly said, insurance is pulling out of California and Florida right now, but if you're replacing two roofs at a cost of $15,000 to $20,000 a roof in Iowa and Kansas, in Missouri, they're going to start pulling out of Iowa. So you don't really need to hear their technical explanations. You can say the scientists have made the connection, found the connection, but once you really get into that jargon, which, I've tried to listen to a lot of NPR reports across the country. Most everyone does a great job omitting that, but it is just so important because people then will just lose interest and tune out. So again, like the use of dirty energy is good because fossil fuels are kind of what are getting there. But instead of CO2 emissions, it makes it seem like you're putting blame on people. While we are to blame, really at the end of the day, the people that are allowing this to happen, I'm not trying to get political here, but the people allowing this to happen are the companies that profit off of this. So it's the dirty energy versus clean energy that the success story of Iowa. Farmers get land leases for wind turbines, and it powers the grid, creating cheap energy. So that's a great way that it's affecting people. So those are just a couple of tips to use the descriptive language. Don't use terms like the, CO2 emissions or you're doing. We don't need to assign blame necessarily. And the traps to avoid. No one wants to make a sacrifice. Try to find creative ways to tell those stories. I found ways to connect, and if you were on the panel, we talked briefly about it. But terms like energy independence is traditionally a conservative philosophy, a conservative principle. But when you're harvesting and creating your own power by what's happening in your backyard or in the farm field next door, that is true energy independence. When you no longer have to rely on foreign entities. And when you are in the oil drilling and fracking business, you're still going to have to rely on other countries that if you're having, low production, they have to pick up the pace and fill in that gap. So true energy independence is when you're able to create that energy in your own backyard. Don't focus or, hyper focus on making a sacrifice by, cutting, having to, cut out meat or, trade in your truck right away for an EV. Don't do about that. Don't frame it in a way where, what did we learn about gas stoves? And that couldn't have been farther from the truth. President Biden, Vice President Harris don't want you to have gas stoves. That's how that story was taken, kind of twisted, right? So I have just a personal take on it. I don't have an EV right now. My wife and I have two perfectly good cars. And I think the waste that's produced by getting cars that are still drivable, putting them into a landfill just to buy an EV isn't necessarily the best thing. We just bought an induction stove. That's because our gas stove had a burner that didn't work and the range didn't heat up to the temperature that it was supposed to. So it was inefficient. And at that point, end of life. So we made that investment then to go to induction, and it made sense for us. So I think blaming people is the worst thing that we can do. Giving them actionable items that isn't going to cost an arm and a leg or cause them to make a sacrifice is also really important. And those are things that you can kind of incorporate into your stories. With that, those are my slides, but I want to talk to a couple of the points that were brought up earlier about trying to find this information. Let me see quickly if I can find the exact question. I forget who it was. Cecilia? Okay, so Celia, sorry. You mentioned wanting to show these trends. There's a great site, and I'll kind of work on a tutorial with you before we open it up for Q&A. But this is a way that you can get the data, know it's accurate data, and not rely on a call back from a scientist who's maybe too busy to get back to you that day. It is called Xamasis. The website is there on your screen, xmacis.rcc/acis.org. It is run through the NOAA Regional Climate Centers. This is where you can look up any climatological data that you want. And keep in mind, what I would recommend, you can do long-term averages. So when that weather station came online, like in 1879, and see how the trend has changed from then to now. But remember, we typically use 30-year cycles because that's the best way to show those climate trends. So the last 30 years versus the first 30 years, how have those averages changed? So for simplicity, let me just show you, for example, how the number of 90-degree days. Anyone want to shout out a bigger city in the Midwest that you want to hear this about? Any takers?
How about Des Moines? Is that big enough? Or
that's big enough, yes. And it's actually, I was just working on this yesterday.
Okay.
So yes, we'll use Des Moines. So we'll go to single station. We'll go to seasonal time series, and this just takes a lot of playing around. And if you have questions, I'm happy to hop on a 5-minute call and walk you through it. So the variable is like, well, how have the 90-degree days changed? Are we seeing more? Are we seeing less? So let's go to maximum temperature, the number of days, and let's do 90-degree days. So we'll end it instead of 2023, we'll end at 2024, since we're not done the year, we'll go to 2023. We'll go to more options and then include a regression line. Back in 1878, the average number of 90-degree days is that you look at the regression line was 25. Now, and it may go down, and I want to see if we can explain why. It went up by 1 day. Okay. So we've seen one more day on average in Des Moines where the high temperature gets up to 90 degrees. Any guesses as to why it may not be as apparent as other parts of the country? Does anyone want to take a guess why?
Is it because of how far away Des Moines is from any huge bodies of water?
That's a good guess. It has to do with water in a sense. What is a big part of the economy in all of the states that you represent?
Corn.
Yes, Maria, thank you. Corn. Corn sweats. Corn sweat adds humidity. Humidity, air that's humid, is a lot more difficult to heat up than air that is. And I think this is a pretty fascinating story. And feel free to take it and run with it, because we're not seeing the increase in these hot days largely because of the monoculture agriculture that's happening there, and especially corn. Corn's a big contributor. Parts of the Southeast had this warming hole. Well, there's also a warming hole here when it comes to daytime highs, and how you're still warming and where we're seeing the most warming in just a second. But in other places, we're seeing those number of days double, where we've only seen an uptick of 1, because humid air, it's difficult to warm it up. So let's look at the low temperatures for fun. And then the number of days where the low temperature is above 70 degrees. Aha. So in this part of the country, in Missouri, in Iowa, in Kansas, the greatest change that we're seeing, because we're still seeing an environment that's warming substantially, are the nights. And this kind of counters even though moist air is difficult to warm up, it takes a long time to cool off. So the nights are getting a lot warmer. So we're seeing a disproportionate number of nights. So back in the 1800s, in 1878, we would only have 16 nights where the temperature at night stayed above 70 degrees. Now we're up to 23 nights. And I would argue that's more impactful than just hot days, because this is the time when your body takes to cool off. Cooling costs a lot of money. So you're also dealing with increased energy costs and keeping that temperature down at night to a survivable number. So there are a lot more impacts, I would argue, to warming nights than just days that are hot. So those are some of the changes that you'd see. You can do this with temperature. You can do this with precipitation. You can do this with rain and snow with precipitation. So you can see those trends as well. It is so easy to use. You can look up how the first and last dates of the first and last freeze has changed. That's one of the options too. So these are all tools just in this one website that you can cross-reference, that you can pull data, that can kind of help you tell that story if you don't have an expert at hand.
Chris, there's a question in the chat from Steven.
Yeah. Okay.
See it?
So would a better measure for the Des Moines? Yes, it would be. However, fun fact, that is something that we don't have climatological records for, Stephen. So the daily climo is high temperature, low temperature, precipitation, average wind speed, average wind direction. That is something that they're starting to collect, a climatological record of dew point, but we don't have the data set just yet. But that will be a very important tool to use, because yes, we're seeing a lot more days where you have heat advisories and excessive heat warnings, not because of the high temperature, but because you have an 85-degree dew point and the temperature is 90 degrees. So excellent question. We're in that process, or the science is in that process, but we're not quite there to have that data set. Okay, Celia, what is your question?
I was wondering, so I guess with this example, we're comparing like the year 1878 to the year 2022. But I
Yep.
guess I'm wondering, would there be a way to compare like 18 averages between 1878 and 1908 and averages between 1992 and 2022 or something, like 20-year averages or something like that? Because comparing just 2 years can be kind of random if 1 year is really hot for 1 year is really cold. Do you know what I mean?
So this is the regression line through the entire timeline. So
Okay.
that was, so yes, but what I did mention is that this is an acceptable way to do it.
Okay.
But the Cadillac of doing climate data is looking at 30-year increments. So if we look at that, so I'll teach you how to do that. So 1993 to 2023, we would look at the average. So we went from 18 to 28 nights.
So that line, oh, I see. So if you looked at the blue line, then it would be that year specifically, but the red line is just that
Exactly.
average. Okay, so you have to
So-
get the regression line.
Correct. So the
Okay.
regression line option is the most important thing that you have to remember to click. So we went from 18 to 28. So the average then was 23. So in that 30-year average, it is going up a total of 23 days. And then you would use the average of those two bookends back in 1878 to what, 1908? 1908, yeah. Look at that, we went down. We went from 18 down to 12. So that could be certainly natural variability. It takes out the Dust Bowl era, that takes out, so that would be then in that whole span of time, 15. So then when you look at that difference, it's pretty significant. When you look at the 30-year averages from what was to what it is now, that's a large increase. So that is just one way that you can, I guess, add, excuse me, add some context to warming trends.
Thinking about
Precipitation.
the nighttime temperatures, I've just been thinking about story ideas here, because you could do an environmental justice story about this that could show, because if you're living in old or outdated housing that is not energy efficient, and you don't have money for hundreds of dollars of air conditioning payments every month, your health will suffer because you're not getting the rest that you're supposed to get. I think that's one part of heat. Of course, there's a lot of other parts of extreme heat. So that's a piece. Children, what about children? How do they react to not getting good sleep in the heat? I know babies don't like it. So I feel like there's a whole thing, a health story and or a environmental justice story that can be done regarding nighttime, because I don't think that's been covered enough, Chris. It's really fascinating to me. It's not we focus a lot about what we're doing in the daylight, but I notice in my 100-year-old apartment that I live in that's made of red brick that at night my bedroom, which is in a certain orientation, takes a lot longer to cool down. And even though I have AC and a fan on, I can tell the difference. So I feel like there's a whole range of and what about art events that happen at night, or concerts or sporting events that, yes, it's fine to be out there sweating to the oldies, If it's,
Right.
75, but if it's 95 or I went to a concert last August where I was dripping with sweat without even dancing. And so it's sort of like the nighttime, the thing is really interesting that hasn't been covered a lot. So there's really some opportunity there. And also too, what is nighttime important for in certain crops? I don't know. I don't know if there's a nighttime angle for food either, but it's certainly a really interesting undercovered piece of climate change because we focus so much on the daytime.
Yeah, it is. And if you have the chance, just to even become, if it's not your beat, just do something as a citizen that's important in understanding our country's racist practices back decades ago. And you could argue we still have them. But look up the old redlining descriptions of some neighborhoods in your cities. They exist. And you'll see that really a lot of those communities still hold those descriptions. That was one of the stories I did in Boston, in a relatively progressive part of the country. I did that story and the pushback was severe. People really showed their true colors in that. But it was sad because it was so accurate, because if you looked at those descriptions, they didn't change. In fact, now there's just more industry, there's more gray infrastructure, there's less trees in those neighborhoods than there was back then. And yeah, those lines were erased by the Fair Housing Act, but if you're not giving people the ability to move out of those environments, you're not going to change what those redlining laws were intended to do. So I think that that is important just for everyone to really understand. It was such an eye-opening experience for me to go through that data and read through it and understand it and internalize the impacts. So absolutely. And to build on what Holly said, some of those stories is finding somebody. So it's not just people who are living in these situations. What do a lot of those people do that live in environmental justice communities all day? They have the jobs where they're working outside all day, can't keep cool, and then they go home to an apartment that is so hot that the body temperature can't cool off. So yeah, you can get these stories, and there's multiple stories right there alone. And the flip side, when it comes to crops, there is good news with climate change right now. Sometimes you're putting in multiple rotations, which is huge, multiple corn yields in the course of a season, but that will end. Corn's been genetically modified to keep up with the changing climate. And I worked with one corn geneticist who said, we're going to reach the point where we're no longer going to be able to keep up. And corn is a very durable crop. But at one point, we're not, it's not going to be possible. So then what happens to all of the industry in Iowa, in Nebraska? So let's see, what other questions do we have? Right, yep. Awesome, awesome. Harvest Media. Yeah, Emily, and if you need any tools on this, it's addictive, maybe more so for somebody that's a climate and scientist and meteorologist, but it is kind of fun.
NPR jumped on the harvest bandwagon and did their own story on corn sweat. But I know that it's been talked about by harvest reporters and for a while here in our region. And it's, it's an interesting phenomenon that that again, not talked about a lot until suddenly someone on a coast thinks it's a really exciting thing to talk about. But that's a side pet peeve of mine. I won't go down that rabbit hole too much.
Who in here knows the George Mason and Yale program on climate change communications? Is there anyone that is unfamiliar with it? Okay, so
I
all
see
of
a
you.
couple of people who do know it. I'm unfamiliar with.
Okay, so this is a really good way for us to understand, and please zone out if you want to build on something I'm saying, by all means, if you know about it. It's a great data visualization tool, but it can also help you in seeing what stories would be most effective in your area. So they looked at, let's see. They looked at the
What's
six
it called? What's
Americas.
it called again? George Mason what?
University and the Yale program on climate change communication. I am going to share my screen again. So I have these tabs ready to go that I'm pulling up for this. Okay. So a little bit of background. They've been keeping their finger on the pulse of climate change opinion in the country now for a couple of decades, which is helpful for us to understand how communicating climate change and climate science is going. If you look at this, they've broken down their survey groups into what they call 6 Americas. So it goes from alarmed all the way down to dismissive. And the dismissive category makes up about 11% of the country. But what they found is the remaining 89%, even the doubtfuls, are willing to have a civil conversation and learn about climate change. So out of the gate, and I tried to explain this to my station management at the time in Des Moines, it fell on, I mean, they didn't listen to me. I had them pull data for Iowa. They still didn't listen to that. But unfortunately, this category, the dismissives, even though they're anywhere from 9 to 11%, are the loudest. They're going to write in every time they hear the mention of climate change. But the good news in all of it is that 89% of the listening audience is willing to hear about it, which is pretty remarkable. So that is how they've kind of broken up the United States. But the other tool here is the climate opinions tab. And this goes by state, by county, by congressional district on all of these categories. From, do you believe global warming is happening? A presidential candidate whose views global warming is important. It's important to me. It's important to my vote. All of that. From risk perception, is it happening now? One of the most shocking things is people don't believe climate change is happening to them or they're being affected by it, whereas they're from areas that major hurricanes have rapidly intensified and have caused destruction, because we're still not doing the best job at communicating that it's here right now. And the media watchdog group, Media Matters, has done a really good job at taking air checks. They haven't done this for radio, but they've done it for even the public broadcasting side of news. They've done PBS, they've done ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, and they've taken every story where climate change could be attributed to the extreme weather event, and they broke down the mention of how often it is covered. Now, if you've heard of this before, I'm sorry, but if you haven't, I think it's important for those that haven't heard about this research to know that we lived through the hottest year on record globally. And between 2022 and 2023, the coverage of climate change dropped significantly in major media. So when you see the global warming is already harming people, the national average is only 58%. And you're telling me that places like Florida at 58%, every single coastline, piece of coastline in the last 5 years in Florida has been affected by climate change because of major hurricanes, Ian and Dorian on the eastern coast. I mean, it's mind-blowing, but it's because largely the media is responsible because they're not connecting the dots effectively. So you see areas and there are connections. Why is West Virginia so low? It's pretty obvious. Coal is still a big part of the economy there. Places like Wyoming and North Dakota, pipeline industry is big there. So to understand this map, you really need to see and kind of dissect it and understand why that is. And that's important. But one of the stories that I said when I was in Boston about switching over to green energy jobs, the jobs were higher paying. I found a scientist that helped with this stat. He'll put it into perspective. And he said the people that are directly employed by coal could fit inside Gillette Stadium, which is where the Patriots play. I mean, it's awful that if you're, in your 60s or 70s, you may have to pivot jobs or take an early retirement, but there's been plans, economic plans to help those people go into an early retirement and live comfortably. But still, a lot of the misinformation, disinformation is like, oh, all these jobs are going out. But there was a plan for all of that, unfortunately. So I don't want to ramble, and we only have 15 minutes, and I want to open up to anybody else that has questions that can add examples, build on anything I've said. Let me drop this link in here. Email address. Number. Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth from Harvest has used me. Holly, you've asked me to help with a story. I'm always happy. And if I'm not the right person, by all means, keep that Rolodex big, because that's one of my biggest beefs with national media, especially. For a while, I was showing up on CNN and MSNBC, and just with my job, it's gotten too crazy. But we have all of this consensus, and only 25% of the population believes that there's a consensus. And one of the reasons is every time you flip on the news, there's 2 climate scientists that climate change. I think somebody in our panel the last time said, find that second name in a peer-reviewed publication and get that person to talk about it. They played as much or probably even more than the lead author of that research. Get them, talk to them, use them and their expertise, because we need to show that our lineup is more than just Michael Mann and Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. While they're great, there's more than just those 2 people.
I love tapping into our university systems. Many of them have very robust, a lot of them are land grant universities, so they're very in tune with this kind of thing, and they're constantly wanting their people to be experts in the news, and some of them are quite niche, which can be interesting because you may have not known about that story. I mean, you may ask, you're maybe interviewing them for something else, and they mention, oh, by the way, I'm studying the impact of the fact that nighttime is still hot. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And so those are good places to have your Rolodex, not just the public schools either. Some of the private, smaller universities, colleges have some really good experts, and they're getting to be more diverse as well. There's some really interesting folks doing research in our region. And so, look up, and if you don't know where to start, I just usually start with the communications person for the university, and say, this is what we're working on. And they'll find me like 5 people, and then one of them can talk to me or wants to talk to me. It is true, Stephen, to your point, that some don't want to talk about anything controversial, but I've been doing a lot of well, not a lot. The Midwest Newsroom has been doing more. Oh, state climatologists are good. I use the state climatologist from Iowa, and he was happy to talk about, climate change. And Nebraska has a new state climatologist who has a track record of being quite vocal. And so I think that I haven't been faced with someone who has at least given me that as a reason, Stephen, that it's too controversial. I guess they wouldn't say that. But I did find the person I found for the manufactured home story about, our manufactured homes safe for, extreme weather, was a University of Kansas researcher. And so I think that it may take a little bit of relationship building or persistence in that way. But, and none of the, I mean, I'd love to do all these stories tonight, but we can't. So, building those relationships when you don't need the story, or just say, hey, I'm going to be in Lawrence. I want to know if you want to have coffee while I'm passing through, and maybe in the future there'll be a story that we can work on together. I have a question for Michelle in Springfield. What is it like in terms of your audience? Do you know what people think in that part of Southwestern Missouri about, do you get letters and phone calls when you talk about climate change?
No, I think the biggest thing that we run up against is when we try to find a source, they're reluctant to say the term climate change. And we kind of have to push back on that, but there's just so many people out there, it seems like, that are worried about their funding being cut. Living in a conservative state, they're worried about state funding being cut. So it can be difficult sometimes to get people to talk openly about it.
Yeah, I could see that.
And you talked about the university sources here on campus. Our communications department isn't very helpful when it comes to finding people for you to talk to. So what I do is I'll find the administrative assistant's email and I'll send them an email, and then they share it with their department and say who would like to talk about this. And I think that's more helpful for me anyway.
That's pretty smart. I like that. I've been known to troll every bio of every professor in a specific department sometimes, and if their email is on there, which it usually is. But sometimes I don't know because I'm not an expert, for example, in whatever that is. So that is helpful to use that tool of the administrative assistant or someone who can share your message. And I think, with a lot of good, helpful information here, from Chris about focusing on the thing that we're seeing rather than the terminology. So I want to talk to a professor about the fact that our night times are so hot, or I want to talk to a professor about the fact that, our infrastructure is not set up for the amount of flooding we've been getting lately. I think that might be, the way in many ways is talking about it from the problem exists. So that is not in dispute. It's not in dispute that we are flooded every August when we get rain or whatever it is. And so I think that that might be at least the door opener, and building trust over time with sources like that. Maybe they'll become they're probably less worried about, they can often be worried about a journalist if they haven't worked with a journalist before. Like, how's this person going to frame my story if I mention the term climate change? And so I think that that's also where building relationships now when you don't need the story is a good one. Thanks for joining us, Stephen. We're about to wrap up anyway, I think. Any other questions before we go?
This is maybe getting into like a whole different can of worms. So if it's possible to answer quickly, I would appreciate any insight. So I work on a talk show, and it's radio first. We don't put out very long web builds. And all of this data is awesome and it's so cool, but I feel like that's probably something that's like harder for people to digest and this conversation has been fascinating, but I just wonder like what you think about like conversations based communication of this information, and like, I think obviously like people being impacted by it is like an easy way to go. But I think sometimes just like kind of like what you're like the kinds of things that you're saying like are really fascinating, but I don't really know how to like put it into like a Q&A format sometimes is where I get stuck.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to, and I'm sure you do this, but to walk them through a process before you take them into a Q&A type setting, where to make sure that they are efficient at having concise answers, right? There was this professor that I talked with, Dr. David Keith, who was just on the New York Times. I covered him a while back. He's the one who said about putting aerosols up into the atmosphere to block incoming solar radiation to drop the Earth's temperature. Smart guy. If I had him on like a talk show setting, I think every listener would tune out because I just could really, I eventually said, could you like give an analogy to what you're saying? Because it's just so technical. And essentially it was like, on a cloudy day, the temperature's cooler. So putting up aerosols blocks out the sun's incoming radiation like clouds do, dropping the temperature. So he would have been a terrible guest to have on. But I do think sometimes asking them, and even though this might not be kosher, but some questions that they want to talk about and feel comfortable about having a conversation, and then hopefully it grows organically instead of, you don't necessarily have to give them the questions ahead of time, but just kind of ask them like, what are your specialties? It doesn't do you any good if you make them look bad by asking them things that they can't answer. But I do think it's an effective format. I think you have the opportunity to go in depth, and I think you can get people to open up and tell their stories and share their stories. But I would certainly kind of filter out who you talk to and make sure that they're up to the task.
And
Happy
depending
to
on
talk
your
about
host, yeah, I mean, depending on your host and their comfort level, I mean, when I'm in an interview, of course, I don't do live interviews, but when I'm trying to talk to someone, I say, you know, I didn't understand that, you know, or, you know what, for those of us who did not go to, you know, Mississippi State and get a meteorology degree, can you tell me, can you say that again? You know, yeah, like a little bit of that. And then again, not every host is comfortable with, you know, showing that they don't understand what the heck you just said. But I think that the audience will appreciate that, and the person might be, oh yeah, yeah, of course. I'm so used to talking to a classroom, but here it is, you know, sun hot, you know, cloudy days, whatever, or bigger hail, or whatever it is, you know. So I think that there's probably a way to do it that, and then I know how you do a lot of like when you call these people and try to book them, you try to get that sense, and you know, the more that you can, you know, say to them, if we asked you it this way, would you be able to explain it in layman's terms? Or if we asked you this question, would you be able to explain it in layman's terms? Because I think when, as you say, the questions are really, really important so that you get a rich conversation, so that you're not stuck after 5 minutes and they're done, you know. And Steve Kraski's like, okay, now what do I do?
Right. And I feel like that's sometimes the other thing is like you run into like the conversation feels stilted because it's like you are trying to get across like, you know, the information that would just be like the setup to the heart of the story in a web build, or even in a feature where you have somebody narrating. So I don't know. I don't know.
I think
One
I
thing I
think
would,
oh, go
if
ahead,
I could
Maria.
just say one thing quick, I think one thing is just taking a slice of it, right? So, you know, we do a ton of climate stories. Kate Grumke in St. Louis just did a story about how we're probably going to see more lawsuits and fights over water in the Midwest that we've traditionally seen in the West. So if you take something that people are like, oh, they get it, right? They understand that they need water. And if you can point to, yeah, we're having more projects that are taking water out of the Missouri River, or fights between states over water, and then have like 2 or 3 experts on a show to explain that, then you know you're getting at they'll talk a little bit about climate change, but I think it's taking kind of concrete examples that people can wrap their heads around.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and Kate had that great quote: "Whiskey is for drinking, water's for fighting." That was like I mean, you know, I think this is the more you can bring it to I think the hot nights would be a great story that you could talk to people about, that people can relate to, because even if you have the latest in air conditioning, you're paying more for air conditioning. And I think that would be a really interesting way of talking about something about this conversation that is not talked about a lot. Yes, it's hot during the day, but the more important thing is that it's hot at night. You know, I think that would be a good, you might maybe play with that as an example, you know, almost like a pilot, you know, and see if see what Steve Kraske thinks, and how you could bring someone on to talk about that in a conversational way. Because I think that that's a good point. And you do have, so you have a gift of having many, many minutes to really dive into something which people can get a better sense of what's happening. So that's a great thing. Wow, this has been awesome. Chris, this is the first kind of masterclass type of format we've done. So I love the deep dives. We have some new tools we can use. We have your slideshow. We have some story ideas. and we have your email address and your home address and your phone number. No, I'm kidding. I will.
I did. I did.
Hello, I'm Emily Yonker. I'm here because I need help, Chris. I've come all the way from Kansas. But yeah, and Chris is really generous with his time and his knowledge. So and he knows a lot of other people in the field as well. So great resource. Thank you so much for coming, everybody, and sticking it out with us. We had a pretty good percentage of people who stayed with us throughout, so that's awesome too. And of course, this will be recorded, so you'll have that information. You can go back and look at it. So great. Chris, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thanks, everyone.
Send me your
Appreciate it.
bill, your invoice. Okay. Thanks a lot,
Thanks,
guys. Have a
everyone.
good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.